And welcome to you all to the latest event in our Non-Fiction Lab 2021 Creative Resilience series. Today's topic is creative writing getting published. And we have as our special guest, Adjunct Professor Sophie Cunningham, who's going to share her wisdom and experience on how to approach and work with agents and trade publishers. And I'll introduce Sophie properly in a moment. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Carlin. I'm a writer and a member of the Writing and Publishing discipline here at RMIT and one of the co-directors of the Non-Fiction Lab research group with Julianne Van Loon. So I'm the host for today's talk and the conversation that we hope will flow from it. To begin with, I'd like to say that I'm joining this conversation today from the South Coast, where I'm lucky enough to be living at the moment, where the lands and the waters of the Gadubanud of the Eastern Maar people meet the lands and waters of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the Aboriginal traditional custodians of these unceded sovereign lands and waters, and of all the lands on which we're conducting this conversation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today. And before we start, let me just flag now the third and final event in our Creative Resilience series for this year. It's entitled Hot Scholar, Peter Murray on how to present research. And it's going to be on Thursday, the 7th of October, same time, 12:30 p.m. Drawing on her Hot Scholar project, a fabulous Hot Scholar project, and her experience in performance and querying scholarship, Peter Murray will present invaluable tips on how to craft and deliver a memorable and effective research presentation. And if you've ever heard Peter deliver a research presentation, you know she knows what she's talking about. So in the session today, Sophie's going to start off by sharing some of her thoughts and practical advice on the topic, but we want it to be an informal, interactive conversation with lots of time for question and discussion. So feel free to leave comments and questions in the chat as Sophie talks, and I'll try and keep an eye on them as we go. Sophie said to me the other day, after a large photo of her had appeared in the Saturday Age to do with her involvement in the project in the Melbourne Writers' Festival, that she was kind of famous, but people didn't know what for. And that's probably because she does so many different things. Apart from being an adjunct professor with us, she's the author of 7 books, including novels, non-fiction, and a children's book. She's an editor, a teacher, has been a gardener at Alcatraz, a former publisher, co-founder of the Stella Prize, former chair of the Literature Board of the Australia Council, a former columnist, a former arts reviewer, and a mentor to many. Her next novel, This Devastating Fever, which she talked about at a Non-Fiction Lab present tense event a couple of years ago, is due out in 2022. And she's also working on a new non-fiction project, The Time Machine, which she's currently pitching to publishers. And I think she's going to talk a little bit about that today. So welcome, Sophie.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and I'm in fact still pitching the novel as well. That I don't mean to suggest they're not interested in it, but we're going through the proposal of the period where we're talking to publishers. I thought I'd preface everything I'm going to say today is really based on a world in which we're not in lockdown, and that's I'm not just trying to be a downer, but it does have some implications. And my agent has said she didn't want to pitch to send through the pitches that she and I have been working on together. Not necessarily. She's not necessarily waiting until the pandemic is over, because that could be a long wait, but certainly until there's a bit more of a sense of us being close to opening up and spring. And the actual phrase she used was, everyone's too sad at the moment. So I'm just going to ignore that reality, because I'm very confident that, you know, even if it happened 3 months later than I thought it would, that, you know, I'll manage to at least get some, you know, get the kind of interest I need to get the books published. But my kind of experience is a bit of a hodgepodge, because I used to work as a publisher and editor, but I'd also teach creative writing. And to be honest, quite a bit of what I want to say is the things that I have learnt since I left publishing, rather than skills I necessarily had when I was in publishing. I mean, when I was a publisher, I was not hugely interested in pitches. That is, if people kind of tried to wow me with pitches, I wouldn't necessarily it didn't necessarily grab my attention. I was always looking for very specific things and very specific qualities, and those were the things that I was looking out for, rather than being hugely worried about whether someone could write an amazing synopsis or talk about their work in a really performative way. But I do appreciate that the industry has changed, and also I think I wanted to talk about the fact that every time you kind of talk about your work or approach anyone in a professional sense about your work, there's always a different purpose behind any particular approach. And one of the things I have learned to do is to talk about my work more than I really want to, as a way of practicing my own capacity to talk about my work in a way that grabs people's attention. And so I practice on people, and I'm working on a project, not one I'm talking about today, but it's not a book project, but it's still pitching effectively. And I have basically spoken to 15 people about it over the last 2 or 3 days, which is partly about sharpening up my act rather than because they necessarily needed to hear it, even though I did pick people who would be ultimately, I hope, interested. And when I was listening to an audio, I think that it was called The First Time, Kate Mildenhall, I think, put it together. She was interviewing someone about pitching. They said things like being conversational and confident, and I think that those are important qualities, but very hard to do, because that sense about not trying too hard, about being confident and sure enough of your work that you're not being needy about it. You're not kind of expecting people to have a dramatic reaction. It's like, this is what I'm doing and I know it's really good and you might be interested. So very easy to say, much harder to do. But I find that making myself talk about these things, seeing these issues, these strategic issues as much a part of the job as being the creative fun bit, is something I've had to teach myself to do. So other things I have done, another kind of experience I've had, I'll just share because it is sort of relevant, was in different stages of your career and with different types of projects, how you present and how you pitch yourself changes. So I didn't have any trouble as a, inverted commas, hot young thing selling a sexy first novel. I didn't have to do a lot. But it is much harder to sell a serious book about trees and climate change, or also I'm no longer a hot young thing. And this is not, again, I'm not trying to be needy here, it's just a statement, like of excitement and about someone new, and they're going to give them a go, and inevitably, it doesn't matter how established you are, over the course of your career that changes. And so I think I've learnt to not assume that my experience or expertise builds on itself in a way that others will understand. I act as if every time I'm a first-time author who has to grab someone's attention. And that took a bit of sort of soul-searching, really, to understand that you can't just assume anything about how people are going to receive you. So I recently, for example, invested. Some of these things are things that people do quite comfortably. I have finally invested money in building a website, and it's not actually a very fancy website, but it lists all my public speaking events, recent articles, books I've had published, so I can just say to people, if you're interested, you could just go here. So I don't have to kind of get bogged down in that when I'm talking to people, but nor do I have to deal with the embarrassment of them going to sort of an old site that doesn't work and they can't find any of the information they need. So I started to invest that kind of money. I've professionalised myself is the phrase I've used here in my notes, because while I said it's good to be conversational, you also do have to remember that these things are always kind of strategic. And I've also developed a skill, which is a slightly sleazy skill, at trying to just make sure that people know it's coming and to look out for it. And I would really like, I make it clear to a publisher that I've chosen them for a particular reason, and that's not an insincere thing. That is, I do only send to publishers that I would be interested in working with, or I think would be genuinely interested. But I sort of state that up front. I kind of say, the reason I have approached you is X. You publish other books in the area. You've always shown, say with the Leonard Woolf book, there's one particular publisher who's always been interested in the Bloomsbury Group, and often comments on my Instagram posts about, oh, this is the one book of yours I'm really interested in. And I kind of like that. She's not saying, I want to publish everything you do. She's not saying she loves all my work. She's saying this is of real interest to me. So I kind of try and make these, any approaches specific rather than generic. I realise I'm kind of talking about the ways in which I do it, and I'm blurring the lines between how I do it. And that is, to some of this, I went through a period where I didn't have an agent, and I would do it myself because I have some industry experience. I decided that was a really bad idea. It went against the idea of professionalising myself. It made me too casual. I would assume certain things because of how long I'd been in the industry or whatever. I actually liked having an agent and putting myself on the same footing as all other writers who have an agent, especially as, in my case, there's a whole new generation of publishers and publishing professionals anyway. So like, people don't even know who I am, but they know who my agent is. So I now have an agent, and I practice my pitches on her. Like, she has accepted me, so I don't have to convince her to represent me, but I certainly had to convince her to take on this Devastating Fever, that novel. Because I had various projects on the go, I told her, I basically pitched each of those projects. One was a kid's book, you know, all those different things I do. And she was like, no, I don't think this is going to fly. It's a long conversation to stop. But I thought about what she said and what some other people had said. And so I went back, partly because lockdown meant I had a lot of time to think about things. And I reframed and recasted about 5,000 words of the novel. So it's not like that was 5,000 new words, but certainly it was about 3,000 new words actually, and then about 5,000 pre-existing words, but reframed, recast the whole thing, which actually was a bit of a breakthrough for me, creatively speaking. I said, now if I could keep writing it like this, would you be interested in this? Do you think you could sell this effectively? And she said, yes, this I can work with. And then from that conversation that led me to rewriting the whole book, she read a draft I finished about 3 months ago and said, yeah, this is terrific. Thank you for the work. You still need to do some stuff. I still have some reservations about how commercial a project it is. But then I did another draft and she said, I think you've managed to do all the things you want. I think I can sell it. I think this is now more more commercial. She doesn't mean it's like a huge book, but she certainly doesn't think she has to kind of sort of fudge how broad an audience there is to get publishers interested. So I kind of worked with her quite closely on that. But and I have written a bit of a blurb. She's had some comments on the blurb, and part of what I've also been talking to her, and this is absolutely something I would suggest to other people, is giving her kind of lines, if you like, that she can then use when she's selling it. So I kind of have talked about other writers I'm trying to emulate, the idea of the comparative title. So I mentioned Jeff Dyer, and I've actually gone blank on some of the other people I mentioned. I talk about Michael Ondaatje writing a lot in this area, but I don't pretend that I'm in any way like Michael Ondaatje, but I try and kind of make sure that people are aware of the kind of literature there is in this space about colonialism and Ceylon and those kind of issues, as well as some of the writers that create the voice or the energy that I've been trying to get into the work. And the other, like also and this is with the Tree book, which David, I thought you and I could maybe talk a little bit more about, because I know at some point, as in you could show people the proposal and we could talk, you could ask me some questions about it. But in that book, I talked about the fact in that proposal, I talked about the tradition of nature writing and how that's changed, and mentioned Robert Macfarlane and Beck Giggs and James Bradley, and people who've both influenced, inspired, or you know, working in that narrative non-fiction in this kind of popular science / nature, this kind of weird space that I'm trying to write into. And I think those things are really useful because it does help when people are looking at a lot of material. It helps them to kind of, they're not always bringing their best bits of their brain to looking at things when they're getting lots of stuff on their desk and they're under pressure. So they might say with the novel, where I'm working with different modes, some of the like metafictional modes as well as some straighter historical fiction writing, and there's a kind of a bit of a mashup style. And I think I just used to assume that people would get what I was doing and get my sense of humour, and I don't assume any of that anymore. I say, I'm being metafictional like so-and-so is, and I'm doing, there's a bit of David Foster Wallace, there's a bit of this, there's a bit of that. My hope is that I have made that work, you know. I realise that I should have maybe started up front by saying the most important thing when you're trying to convince anyone about your work, and in my case, I'm trying to convince my agent, and then she can communicate that to publishers. But the most important thing is why you're the right person to write the book, because I'm just going to assume that everyone listening who is working on a book is working on a good idea. But a lot of what you have to convince publishers about is that even if the idea has been written on before, you're going to do something special, that you have something very particular to bring to it, whether it be stylistic, creative, or knowledge base, you know, experience. And I really had, with the tree proposal, I worked and reworked it because my last book was called City of a Tree. So I've written about trees before. A lot of books about trees have come out in recent years. And so actually, like, but the sixth time I wrote that proposal, the one-page kind of pitch, if you like, which was partly for funding bodies, but also for my publisher, for my agent, and she thinks it'll work very well for publishers, is I actually started out with why I'm writing the book. I didn't even say what the book was. I said, in a time of crisis and climate change, we have to deal with these issues now. They're urgent. I'm responding to the urgency. So I tried to create that sense of momentum about the need for the book. I mean, it's sincerely felt, by the way, but I hadn't said that in earlier drafts. So I thought I should be more saying, I've decided to write 15 chapters on, and each chapter is going to cover blah, blah, blah. That kind of stuff can come out in the wash, but the kind of sense about why you're the right person. So I tried to say this is a slightly political perspective on writing about trees. I'm not a biologist, I'm not a scientist. This is why this book has to be written about now, and this is why I'm the right person to write it. And the why I'm the right person to write it was I dealt with that slightly in part through supporting material that went. So I haven't written the book, but I kind of have provided a something I talk about when I teach creative writing. It's kind of like a really upmarket diary. Like, it's a beautifully written working notes. So I try and capture in a literary non-fiction way, the way that would be when it's in the book, an interview I'd done with a scientist about dieback and snow gums and the fact that we're going to lose them all. And so I have written a scene in which I'm talking to a real scientist. I've asked if I can use him in my pitch, and he said yes. But he just started talking about when he was a kid, he used to love playing under snow gums. That's why he now works with them. And then he actually tears started running down his face and said, I think we're going to lose all of them. And so I kind of include that scene, again, to try and support my claim that now is the time to write this book, but also to try and imply that someone with creative writing skills has something to bring to the genre, even if they're not a scientist. I'm trying to say, look, I can get the right appointments with the right people. I can convey my conversations with them. I know enough about science to ask the right questions. So it's kind of like a show-offy thing, being quite strategic about your supporting material. because it's sort of like focused showing off.
Can I ask
Yeah, go for it.
Just so many things that you've raised already, Sophie, and Priyanka in the chat has asked about chronology, and so that makes me think a couple of things. One question is, you know, when's the right time to approach an agent, to approach a publisher? Yeah. How does the chronology work like that? And then a kind of allied question, which is around the difference between fiction and non-fiction projects, like how they operate differently. Or
well, just before I answer that in terms of chronology, I'd say that as a writer, I don't tend to differentiate between fiction and non-fiction, which doesn't mean that publishers don't or agents don't. But so I kind of work in terms of how I do my end of it. I tend to bring similar qualities to my end of it, but I'm aware that different things are required. In terms of the chronology, with the novel, I didn't do anything until the novel was ready. Like, because this is with fiction, people aren't really that interested with a so-called literary novel until they know that you can write the whole thing. They're not prepared. They're not hugely interested. And I have an established relationship with text publishing. I've published most of my books with them. And hand on heart, I mean, they have said, and I know that they would have been prepared to give me a contract for that novel, but it probably wouldn't have been, I wouldn't have been competitive in terms of hoping for a good advance. And it's possible that they might have honoured the contract with a heavy heart. If you know, they sort of signed it up when it was 10, 15,000 words. So,
and does that mean that then they may not really put much into marketing or publicising the book?
But that could be one of the implications. So I think we agreed with each other that I shouldn't be pitching it, like I should show it to them when it's ready. Because I also didn't with it, because you never know, you can't assume relationships will last. I talked about that constant, bringing to every project, not making any assumptions about anything really. So I didn't want to be sending early drafts of that manuscript to a publisher that might not end up publishing it. It's not fair on them. It would be a terrible thing, for example, for me to have asked Mandy Brett, who I like enormously, and got editorial feedback and then taken it somewhere else, or any of those kind of. So for ethical reasons, I didn't want to keep wasting their time too much with the project. And this is actually where funding bodies make those kind of decisions quite tricky, because they're constantly asking for letters of support for projects, asking publishers to provide letters of support with the publishers. Like, sure, I don't know, like, I hope. Like, it's not fair on them, and it's not hugely useful, but it's one of the demands of the job, and techs have always been fantastic with that. But so to answer the question, when was that ready? Two things happened. One is my agent said, I think this is getting, I can work with this, which isn't, you know, like possibly damning me with faint praise, but I was taking it. But then also I did have that much. It has taken 15 years to write, so I make this sound like it was an incredibly difficult and painful process. But then I was writing like I've never written before, and I was like, I have nailed this. This is good. I actually know that I've got the voice right and this is ready. After an extraordinary period of fucking around, forgive my French. So I felt strongly, and then my agent agreed. So that's how I knew in that case. With but I did have a sense of urgency, and I think this is actually why the project managed to come together, because the contemporary voice, I mean, there's a kind of narrator in 2020 during a plague year. So so timing was relevant. So that's one of the reasons why I worked so hard to get it done, because publishers are interested now, but it's possible in 3 years after we all get through this, everyone's going to go, no, we are not interested. So there was a sense of, so the context into which you're pitching becomes relevant. If your book is timely or not timely, or those kind of issues. So with the trees also, I started pitching I worked very hard on the pitch, which I didn't do with the novel. I worked hard on the novel, but not the pitch. With the tree book, I worked hard on the pitch because I need to try and get funding, because I do need to write it quickly, because we are going to lose most of our trees by the middle of the century, most of our old trees. So I don't want to be writing this book in 15 years. Well, one, I'll be very old, but also like the timeliness is a real thing. So I've made that ready and started pitching it, because the bottom line is if it takes 5 years to get anyone interested or any funding, I've probably missed my moment for writing it, and I probably wouldn't finish it. So you have a different answer depending on the book. The fiction, non-fiction specifically, you can, I'm told, and this has been my experience, you can sell non-fiction on a very detailed outline and several chapters without it being finished. It's very hard to do that with a novel. And while you can do it with a novel, as I kind of implied before, it's not necessarily to your or the novel's advantage to do it. So that is a difference. So you can run with the idea with non-fiction in a way that you can't with fiction. You have to, people will say to you, God, that sounds like it's going to be such a great novel. When you have finished, send it to me. So it's a very different kind of conversation in that sense.
Yeah. So, and did you say, are you happy to share? Do you want to share the
yeah. And look, I mean, I haven't actually sold this book, by the way. So it's like, you know, there's also always a possibility you're listening to somebody who's talking a pile of horse shit. But anyway.
Maybe there's someone who will buy it here.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I'm going to just. So as I said in the first, I can already see there's some weird hyphens. Rule number 1: never have any typos in your synopses. I always have them, but there you go. So I actually start with the inspiration, if you like. So that was, you know, last 18 months have been a call to arms. How can I communicate in a way that provide hope, understanding, and possibly change? You'll notice that through the whole proposal, I talk about hope quite a lot, because I know that no one is really interested in a book that says something along the lines of, oh, we're all fucked. Because some days, obviously, I think we all feel a bit like that, but there's just there's no point in writing that book. And if you can't sincerely find it, in this case, a way to connect to the importance of story and communication and hope as a kind of like ethical position, then I shouldn't be writing the book. So I start with this idea. Then I kind of have a slightly more prosaic, this is what the book is. Time machines allow me to write about these things. The oldest trees will be my prism. Now that phrase, our oldest trees will be my prism, was to me was quite a significant one, because I'm trying to say I'm using trees as a kind of filter, or I'm very passionate about climate change, and trees are the way in which I want to tell that story. And trees are indeed time machines. They tell you a history of drought, history of coal, fossil fuels. There's so much written in the life of a very old tree. And some trees live thousands of years. And one of the baobabs that I'll be writing about is several thousand years old. And those trees are also in Africa, and there's like a lot of interesting stories, for example, about the kind of whether the trees are Australian or African. Same with wattle. So at the same time as I'm working on this kind of wording, I'm starting to think, what's an actual story that I'm developing in the book? So I started to pick, and then I took the Matthew Brookhouse. I think I took out, for this version, I took out the fact that he cried. It depends again on the pitch, and I didn't want to be disrespectful to him. Like, he could probably have done without me including that in some of them, but that's in some of the written material that I have. So I've like, I've always got the two documents. So I'm working on the pitch, but I'm also refining my structural stuff. Then I go into a little bit of a research about, like, we're going to lose most of our trees very soon. And then I talk about, this is important, I make it clear that I know what other books are out there. And the bottom line is that no one else has written about this subject for Australian trees. I mean, to answer the question, why this book? There has been much written about, but not about Australian trees. So I was relieved that I could be that clear about what, and then I talk about the kind of writers that have inspired me. And then I do a bit of a summary about people that to make it clear that I understand the range of people I should and need to talk to. I imply that I can, these people will probably speak to me, and that is true. I got together a list of people that I've had initial conversations with. I mean, they might have said, yeah, sure, get in touch in 2 years. I don't know it will necessarily happen, but I didn't just make up random names, but it's not like I've nailed every one of these interviews either. I also obviously thought through, I'm aware of issues around ethics of writing about First Nations people, their totems, their landscapes. And so I made sure that I had a sense of when it's particularly important to talk to them in terms of the particular stories that I'll be writing. And then there's a bit of a list of the kind of different trees. But this is all, and each of the trees, I picked ones that do have stories behind them. So Red Cedar was a very early one that was logged a lot. I actually, Saul Cunningham is my brother. He's a very senior scientist in this country, and he said, of all the trees, this is the tree I want to talk to you about. Now, it's actually to focus on this idea of talking to someone. So Aaron Fayozo is he's an actor and a sportsman. He lives in the Torres Straits. Saul is my brother. I do want this to be a popular commercial book, and so I've done quite a lot of travel writing. So I'm kind of I'm trying to be slightly Michael Palin-esque here, and like, I'm going to go for a walk with these people, and I actually am. And we're going to tell the story of a particular tree in a particular landscape. So I lean quite heavily on non-science conventions to write a book which has a lot of scientific content and gives it some sense of a travel book. You know, so I will be, going to, trying to find or going to visit the most northernmost coconut palm in Australia, which is in the Torres Strait. I will be going to look at snow gums on the highest points that you can find those kind of trees in Australia. I'm going to go to, so I'm basically trying to edge and hide, and there's a scientific logic to that, which is that climate change, trees can't move higher to get away from high temperatures if there's nowhere to go. Climate change means that, rising sea levels impacts on trees on the coast. So the idea of highest, most remote is a meaningful one. So anyway, that's the pitch, but that's the kind of logic that I worked with. And one of the things that I have found, have I frozen?
No, you're still going. Can you hear me? I can still hear you.
Yep.
I think that I'll buy that book now if I was a publisher. Unfortunately, I'm not.
Well, my agent is excited by it. And look, the thing is, and this, I'm aware that a lot of books are being written about what's happening to our oceans and the Barrier Reef, but we have a kind of romantic connection to the oceans, and I wanted to try and bring that idea of kind of a romantic connection to forests.
So Ruth's asking, how long did it take to produce the pitch?
Oh, the pitch, I wrote that in a week. Well, I've been thinking, I mean, because it's genuinely an area, like, I've known that I wanted to tackle this subject. And so I suppose it's been working away in my head, but in terms of how much time it took a week. So, and unlike the novel, I haven't been asked to revise it a lot. My agent's like, this is great. Obviously, I mean, publishers might well say we want to do it, but we need to see several chapters. Like, I'm not, she's actually being more hopeful than I am that we'll be able to sell it on the pitch alone. If I was a publisher back in the olden days, I would have said, I love the idea of this, but I want to see a couple of chapters. So that, you know, that's actually fine. But I have written quite a few articles in literary magazines and newspapers that I could put into supporting material, which might count as chapters. That's what we're hoping.
Right. So now's a good time, I think, for people in the audience, if you do have questions, to put them in the chat, or else put up your hand in the now time-honoured video conference fashion. That would be great. And I'm sure, Sophie, that you have got heaps of other dot points there, that things that you wanted to cover as well. So
yeah, I'm just I know when I was talking about thinking of a specific publisher, like they're having a specific, making it clear to publishers why you're approaching them. That's also one way to start thinking about who you want to approach. Is go into a bookshop, look at the books you like, and think, who published this? And I do that myself, and I've always advised people to do it, rather than just thinking Penguin Books is a big publisher, or like whatever, however you make a decision. So that's one reason. I also think this is something, if you're lucky enough to have an agent, your agent might suggest. But there are disadvantages to small publishing houses, but there are a lot of advantages. One of them is that they take more risks, they're less conservative, and they're prepared to give something a go on 1,000 copies rather than having to sell 10,000 copies or whatever. But I was going to make a...
That's about publishers to choose whether big or small.
Yeah, well, that's right. Small, new publishers, not necessarily small, but like people starting new lists, are more open to receiving proposals because they're not full. Like say, I'm sure Jane Polfreman is considered to be one of the best fiction publishers in the country. She publishes a lot of people already. I assume it is harder, not that I've asked her, but to get onto her list because she already has people like Christos Chalkis or other people sending their books as they write their new books. So in terms of just workload, you can kind of see the problem. So, I mean, for example, Ultimo Press might be someone you would try because they seem to have good people working for them, but also they are establishing themselves. So kind of being strategic about the timing of when you approach people is important as well. And if someone, I mean, I remember this from years ago, if someone is writing a book, say, on masculinity, you may not want to send it to the person who's already written 4 books on that subject because they might say, oh, I've got too many books on this subject. So it doesn't always work to simply approach a publisher saying, I know you're interested in this area. But I do think the homework is really important, even if you do have an agent, because I do think you actually want to kind of make sure that you agree with the agent's choices and be able to kind of push them in the right direction, and not assume that it's going to be clear to them exactly what they should do with the book. I mean, it's all a work in process. And
so Priyanka's asked the 2 great questions. How do you find an agent, and how are agents necessary, or how necessary?
It's really hard to find an agent. Sometimes it can be harder to find an agent than a publisher. I don't have an easy answer to that question. Australian, I'm trying to remember, there's a website, Australian Agents Association. I'll have a look on my phone in a moment, which lists all the ones that are registered and lists the kind of people they're looking for, or the kind of themes they publish in, or the kind of work they do, and what they need to make a decision. So you basically need to go through that. Also, if you have contacts, obviously utilise those contacts, but a lot of people don't. But you don't need, it's particularly hard to be an agent in Australia because you think authors don't make much money. Well, they make 15 or 12.5% of what you make. So, a book I did last year, it ended up doing quite well. It was a kid's book, but my advance was $2,000. So the agent does the work, helps the contract, all that kind of stuff, and they're like kind of like $300, which is like, so you have to be mindful. That's why I actually think doing homework to support agents, if you have one, is important, because you can't assume they can do it all on their own. Well, the other question was whether you need one. You can manage without one, but you do need to be, I think you can get a publisher without an agent. Where I have really felt the strong need for an agent is in negotiating the relationship with a publisher as books are in production and what happens. Because if things don't go smoothly for any number of reasons, your publisher or editor might leave, staff might change, there might be a global pandemic and no one can work from the office, which means things become disorganised. Like, there's any number of things that could go wrong. It's really difficult to kind of sort those things out at the same time as doing your edit, trying to be assertive about your cover. Or you kind of actually need some professional support in maintaining a relationship with a publisher. That's where I personally find it important. And also with contracts. I mean, and the other thing is, it's very hard. You might be, I mean, I've probably made myself sound very confident, but I do know that even with my, you know, hot young thing novel 20 years ago, I think someone offered me that's the only book of mine that, you know, there was an auction for, and it was that kind of exciting, oh my goodness me, and, you know, it's going to be huge, etc. But the first person who offered me, someone said $10,000. I went, yes, take it, take it. And your agent's like, yes, please shut up and go away and leave me to do my job. Like, I couldn't believe in, like, that sort of lack of self-esteem and lack of confidence that we all have about ourselves, almost everyone has, means you're not always the best person to negotiate on your own behalf. So there are reasons to have an agent. But you can pitch in, you know, a lot of publishing houses, if you don't have an agent, you go to publishing houses, you look at their website, they give, so Alan Unwin does this well, advice about how to pitch, which of their publishers are taking unsolicited manuscripts, which aren't. I mean, websites, like, they're spending a lot of time on the internet, reading websites, seeing the information that they're given by various publishing houses. Transit Lounge, and they all do it, is really useful. And you just have to kind of put in those hours, and that will get you a long way if you don't have an agent.
So Grace is asking, how do you reconcile the need to sell the idea to the publisher and remain true to the message of the work?
Well, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can, like, it's not, just because you're having to sell something doesn't mean that you're selling it with an insincere, you know, quality. Like authenticity, you can sell authenticity, I suppose. So that's why with the tree book, it's like, but I tried to make it sound, I didn't say, you must take climate change seriously and worry about trees, and I'm a very serious person, even though I am quite a serious, earnest, you know, person when it comes to those subjects. I tried to make it part of the energy of the pitch. So I kind of tried that kind of, I've never read the Sheryl Sandberg book, but I do like listening, leaning into, I do like that phrase. I kind of, you try and, whatever it is about, so with my devastating fever, I mean, this is a sort of, there was a whole strand in that book which people thought was weird and ridiculous. I actually decided to exaggerate the weird, ridiculous strand of the book, which is a ghost story, for want of a better, you know, very, very quick. And then I actually talked about that in the pitch, about being haunted by literary figures past. So I kind of don't be nervous about it, kind of like make it part of the character of your pitch. So you're not, I don't pretend that slightly difficult aspect isn't in the book. I try and kind of make that sound exciting, you know. So that's kind of like, they're not mutually exclusive. You can kind of remain authentic and true to the work and sell it, in my view.
Oliver is asking, do you have any tips for first timers to publish a finished novel? How to approach an agent publisher? So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by a finished novel, Oliver, but
well, the website, what I said about website stands, like Googling Australian Literary Association, or I'll try and find there. But you can find, like, if you Google Australian literary agents, you'll come up with a list.
Yeah, Julianne's put it in the chat, actually, the link.
Yeah. Okay, you can work through that. The same with publishers. Also go to bookshops, look at similar kind of novels or whatever to get an idea of who in Australia you might approach. But I would also actually really recommend there's any number of courses where you don't have to do a full course, but a weekend course or even a 2-hour thing with Writers Victoria or Faber Academy, RMIT will have versions like this, versions of this, where you get given some really specific advice to support you in the way that an agent might if you were lucky enough to have an agent. But I do actually think that kind of professional development is really useful.
And you were saying when we spoke before about how the industry's changed, and obviously it's changed at the moment because of the pandemic. Is there anything more you'd like to say about that, about where you see, about the sort of what's shifted? I mean, I really picked up about what you said about how every time you approach pitching a new project, you do it as if it's your first one, you don't assume. I think that's really great advice, because often you might think, oh, well, you're Sophie Cunningham, you can, of course, you can trade on that or something. But
I'm also quite old. What I mean is, that's the point. You suddenly realise just because your peers and your friends know who you are doesn't mean, like, a lot of the new publishers are a good generation, if not 2 generations younger than me. And why should they have heard of me if I haven't had, because my books haven't been, my kids' book ended up being a bestseller, but it's not like I have lots of big selling books. But it's also partly about, I think it's a useful mindset, is to never assuming it's like an act of humbleness, which I actually think can stand you in good stead. Like trying to think about how other people hear what I'm saying, what do they see when I pitch this, and kind of reminding yourself there's an audience, which I think you have to do as a writer as well, right? It can't just be about your vision and your passion. It has to be about, well, how does this sound to the person receiving it. So, I remember, I'm going to garble this story a bit deliberately, really, but to convey what I'm trying to say, because but I remember a student once who was like, I'm going to write a novel about, a girlfriend I had, and she killed herself, and she did this, and it was really violent, and this was like a pitch in a group, so a lot of people were all sat there, and a couple of the women said, I know this sounds really horrible, like quite distressing. And and so what really our advice was, how does this sound? Like, and why are you writing it in that case? Are you writing it for yourself, or you're writing it because you want to convey the pain and suffering of a particular woman and you genuinely want to do it? Like, why is something that people have to ask themselves, because you're going to be asked that question by other people. And thinking about why you're writing it also allows you to imagine how it might be like to receive the project as an audience member, whether that be a reader or hearing a pitch or those kind of things.
We have only just a few minutes left. Does anybody else in the audience want to come on camera and contribute to the conversation? I know that there's heaps of people here with varying levels of experience.
David and Sophie, there was just a question in the chat about, I can't remember who popped it there, but it was a question about whether you have any advice for academics who might be looking at, towards trade publishers for the first time. Any advice on that?
Well, in a way, I think it's useful not to think of it as different. That is, obviously, the birth of the project is different, but you're still trying to reach, it's probably getting someone to read a version of the project or practice your pitching on someone who doesn't have expertise in that area. because someone can help. So it is possible that you are writing a project that has what to other people seems like jargon, but to you is just kind of instinctive language use, depending on one's department, a specialty and all those things. So you would really want to kind of just check that at the door, as someone might, I don't know, might have said. So, and you probably do that by getting a reader who's outside your area to kind of give you feedback on that, because the publisher, and certainly publishers, are allergic to the sense, if you send a publisher a version of your PhD and say I'm going to rewrite it for a commercial audience, that's a bad move, would be my advice. They would want you to see, so maybe you might rewrite a chapter in a more tradey voice to show you can do it, or you need to kind of not just leave them to assume you can do that job, because it's a big job. And in my own experience, it can be really hard to work with your own material and turn it into something else, and that's worth, like, it might be that one shouldn't be trying to sell an academic book to a commercial publisher, but one should be doing a book that results from their academic work. But you almost treat it as a separate proposal, I think that's what I'm saying, in a long-winded way, rather than saying I'll just rework an existing project. Does that make sense? So I don't know if you have written a book about kind of like, I've just done a book for the Botanic Gardens on kind of plants you plant in 2090 because of climate change. I mean, there's an essay on that. There's lots of very serious research about data points and seed species, whatever. You would never pitch all that data to try and sell the idea of that story. You would say,
oh, you've frozen up. We lost you just for a moment.
Okay, I suppose I'm just saying you would rewrite the source material is source material. You wouldn't really share that with the person you're pitching the project with. One
last question that just occurred to me, talking about partly about the kind of intersection of academic and trade. I know that you've edited a anthology. I'm not sure if you had to pitch that or if they came to you, but is there anything?
That was a very specific project. I hate to break people's heart. That was Copyright Agency wanted to put money into the system because there was a global pandemic. It wasn't going to last very long. We all needed a bit of cash. So they developed the project, said they would fund it, and then they called me and said, we will pay you X amount of money. So they didn't get a royalty. Usually, if you edit an anthology, you do a huge amount of work and you would be lucky to make $1,000. So if you don't have an income, as I make my living as a freelancer, I could never have afforded to edit that anthology under normal circumstances, because you kind of do the maths in your head. If the book sells for $20 and there's 20 people in the book and it sells for, and then everyone's getting paid up front and then you get a percentage, and there's so little money in that model of publishing. So you usually has to have funding coming from elsewhere, as my project did.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're almost up to our 1:30 time. So thank you so much, Sophie, for all of that, the insights into your experience, and also the tree project in particular, which is fantastic to see. And I think it's a real gift to actually show us that proposal, to see.
I'll let you know what happens. It'll be a bit demoralising for all of us if we've got it all invested in my project. If it doesn't sell, I'll let you know, David, and you can pass it on.
Well, you can come back either way.
Yeah.
So thanks very much, and thanks to everybody for joining us this lunchtime for our latest Creative Resilience. And as I said, we're having another one in October with Peter Murray. So have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you all soon. Take care. Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks so much. It was wonderful. See you.
Bye.